Okay, this is the first video lecture for James Still's River of Earth. First, I want to give you some background on James Still himself, the author James Still. Now, we're moving into a bit of a different era in this unit of Appalachian literature. We've looked at local color, and we've had a representative author there, John Fox Jr. Here, we're looking at authors, beginning to look at authors from within the region, who identify more with the region itself. James Still is significant because he is widely seen as one of the first of the truly Appalachian regional writers. Now, that term regional itself is probably something we should maybe take issue with or just kind of look at with a bit of a grain of salt. Certainly he's a regional writer, but with a term like regional writer, there's often the insinuation that that writing is only significant within that region or is significant for that region. James Still's writing and the writing of many authors from within the Appalachian region certainly goes beyond the region. It's accessible beyond the region. One of the early reviewers of River of Earth had this to say about the idea of regional writing, and specifically the idea of River of Earth. You can say it as regional writing, but to say so is to say that all America is not cut from the same piece. In other words, it's to say that there is something distinctly different about this, that it is not American in some way. And certainly we can't see that with James Still. So with John Fox Jr. and contemporaries like him, local color writers, those who we've identified as local color writers, their work was influenced by many of the common stereotypes of the time that was in the news reels of the time, in the newspapers of the time. They were influenced by that in their writing, and you saw that very distinctly in John Fox Jr. And in their writing, they went on to perpetuate that sense of stereotype, those stereotypes that were common. These writers were not necessarily, or not as distinctly of the region as someone like James Still and other writers that we'll be looking at. John Fox Jr., he went to Eastern Kentucky, he lived there, he had a high regard for the region, but he remained essentially, in his perspective, an outsider. In Trail of the Lonesome Pine, you remember that the narrator consistently analyzed the people, evaluated the region. There were long discourses about the idea of the contemporary ancestor, things like that. These works were, in their way, it can be argued that these works were in their way as exploitive of the region and the people of the region as the timber and coal industries that came in and were exploitive economically and exploitive of the resources. So we're going to see a very distinct difference in many ways from John Fox Jr. to James Still. James Still was not born in Eastern Kentucky. He was born in Alabama, in Lafayette, Alabama. He received, in 1906, he received an A.B. from Lincoln Memorial University, an M.A. from Vanderbilt University, and he studied to become a librarian. When he was at Lincoln Memorial University, one of his classmates was another celebrated Appalachian author, Jesse Stewart. Jesse Stewart and James Still were friends, and they maintained a correspondence throughout their lives. They knew each other and admired each other's work. Now, unlike John Fox Jr., James Still did not come to Eastern Kentucky to speculate in minerals. He also was not part of the missionary socialist movement that was fostered by the stereotypes of the region, fostered by much of the local color writers such as John Fox Jr.'s, influenced by that, motivated by those ideas. He came to Knott County, Kentucky, during the Depression era to get a job. That was what brought him to Knott County. So he was not a missionary. He was not a social do-gooder. He was not there to reform people. He came because he needed a job. So in 1932, he was offered the position of librarian at the Heinemann Settlement School in Heinemann, Kentucky. And the Heinemann Settlement School is another topic that we might touch upon later on, as that was one of the many settlement schools that did come out of the missionary idea and the idea of educating the people. And it was not, I don't mean to disparage it, it was not a bad thing. It was actually a very positive thing, one of the positive things to come into the region. But James Still became a librarian. And in this time, in the 1930s, there were not good roads, speaking specifically about Knott County. So it was common for librarians to take books around to different schools, to the different small schools around the county, either on foot or by a pack mule or a pack horse or a pony. So for many years, James Still did that. And he came to become very fond of Knott County. He liked Knott County, he liked Eastern Kentucky, he liked the natural world that he found there, and he liked the people that he found there. And this would have, many years before the strip mining occurred. This was before all the strip mining, and Eastern Kentucky and Knott County, well, Knott County not so much, but Eastern Kentucky generally shows a lot of the signs of strip mining. The impact. We read about it all the time. If you go there, you'll see it. If you fly over it in a small airplane, you'll really see it. But this was many years before that. So when he came to Knott County, he felt that he had found a home, and he settled into a log house on Wolf Pen Creek. This is in Knott County, on Little Car Creek, which is not far from where Car Fork Lake is today. Car Fork Lake was a man-made lake, and he lived there for many years. Now, as I talk about James Still, and as I talk about this text, River of Earth, occasionally I'll give you some personal remembrances of James Still. I knew James Still. I had the good fortune to know him for several years when I was myself teaching in Knott County at Alice Wood College during the time that I knew James Still. So I'll remember things that he had said occasionally. And one of the things that I remember is that he would take offense if somebody referred to the log house that he had lived in as a cabin. He didn't like the idea of it being referred to as a cabin. He would say there's a big difference between a cabin and a house. I lived in a log house, not a cabin. So that was something significant to him. He settled in well. He was friends with neighbors. He had good relationships with people. He kept a garden. He was very fond of his garden. I can recall having been to his home there and seeing how he lived and seeing his garden. I was much younger. I was much younger at the time. This is something that he himself wrote about his own writing. It's from an essay called A Man Singing to Himself. How did you avoid, in quotations, hillbilly writing? Meaning essentially, I would think, local color writing, is another question I frequently hear. Those who ask that question have in mind the stereotypical mountaineer and his dialectical speech as rendered by several authors of fiction in the past, and we could name many of those, I'm sure. My answer is I was hardly aware of those authors, didn't have access to their books. My experience was with the folk themselves. As for handling dialect in my writings, in the effort to represent the way folk actually talk, well, dialect of any sort on a printed page has always bothered me. Peculiar spellings can't account for the tone of voice, the body language, or the intent behind the statement. My aim is to invoke speech, to try to get the true sound of it to happen in the reader's head. Aberrant spelling rarely accomplishes it. I try to preserve the voice of the speaker. That is in stark contrast to the method that John Fox Jr. used. You think about the dialogue, the dialect in Trail of the Lonesome Pine, the aberrant spellings, the phonetic spellings, the drop letters, the attempt to capture directly on the page each precise nuance of language. And to my reading, as I read that in John Fox Jr., it's intrusive, and I don't believe that it works very well. I believe that it fails. Steele is saying what he is trying to do is to suggest dialect. So there will be a phrase, there'll be phrases, expressions that people would have used at the time. Now, this was set in the 1930s, so we're in contemporary times. There are probably some expressions that you're going to see in River of Earth that you're not familiar with. But what Steele is trying to do is he is trying to capture the truth of the language and the realness of the language, but not to have that effort become intrusive. He wants to suggest dialect to us so that after we become familiar with it, after we're exposed to it, we begin to hear it. He wants us to hear the language. Now, some of the other things, the narrative voice in River of Earth, and if you've gotten very far into it, you'll see this, is that of a young boy. And you'll see, again, in contrast to Trail of the Lonesome Pine, there is not commentary being given to us by this narrative voice. So it's first person. The narrator is a young boy who is, he's involved in the story, but he is observing more than he is involved. So he is a central character, but what's also important is everything that's going on around him, what he sees of his parents, the experience of all the people. He is reporting things to us. And we, in taking that approach, Steele is working fairly successfully, I would argue, to remove the intrusion of the author. There's not a sense that there is a overwhelming voice behind the scenes telling us things, telling the reader things, explaining things to the reader. We just have a voice, a narrator showing us things. Again, contrast that with Trail of the Lonesome Pine. Okay, some other biographical notes about James Still. He served in World War II from 1942 to 1945 in Africa and the Middle East. In the 1960s, he taught at Morehead State University. There is a special collections room at the Morehead State Library with papers of James Stills as well as with papers of Jesse Stewart in special collections. Other of his papers are held in trust at the University of Kentucky, and so primary papers, primary sources. Throughout his career, he was a poet as well as a fiction writer. He is best known for River of Earth, but he may have regarded himself primarily as a poet. And in River of Earth, you will see the poetic mind at work. You will see imagery, poetic imagery. It's described, The River of Earth is described very often as a lyric novel. So he published poems, short stories, and had success early in his career in publications in many of the acclaimed literary journals of the time that are still around, actually. The Atlantic, for example, Esquire, the New Republic, many well-known literary journals. His first book was a book of poetry called Hounds on the Mountain, and that was published in 1937. Other books on Troublesome Creek, a book of short stories, was published in 1941 that followed River of Earth. Pattern of Man, a book of short stories, was published in 1976. Run for the Albertas in 1980 is a book of stories. He also published several books for children. River of Earth was published for the first time. It was republished again later on in 1940. And it was co-recipient that year of the Southern Authors Award, along with Thomas Wolfe's You Can't Go Home Again. Thomas Wolfe, regarded as one of the great American writers. James Still, at this point, with this book, seen as an equal of Thomas Wolfe's. Also, River of Earth was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. And in that year, John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath won the Pulitzer Prize. So James Still was in good literary company. He was seen as being equal to these other great authors who are much more widely known and acclaimed. Now, both Grapes of Wrath, Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, and River of Earth are set during the Depression era of the 1930s, and they involve the experiences of people during this time. Grapes of Wrath deals with the plight of the Oklahoma farmers during the Great Dust Bowl, the environmental disaster known as the Dust Bowl. You probably know about that. I probably don't have to tell you very much about that, but that was the result of over farming, the topsoil erosion. So it was an environmental disaster. And what happened in this time is that farmers could no longer farm, and there were these great storms and clouds of dust that would come and blow and cover up their farms. It was a tremendous environmental disaster. So farmers had to leave Oklahoma and migrate to California. That's what Grapes of Wrath is about. River of Earth focuses on a single family, not an entire group or not an entire state, but a single family in eastern Kentucky who are enduring poverty, extreme poverty to the point of starvation due to the bust of coal industry. There's not work. still received great acclaim for River of Earth, as mentioned. Is recognized for his writing by 2 Guggenheim Fellowships and many other fellowships and many other awards. The thematic conflicts that you're going to see in River of Earth involve those difficulties that are brought to the region by the sudden industrialization of the coal industry, the sudden modernization. Remember, I talked about that a little bit earlier. And I mentioned Ron Eller's book, Miners, Mill Hands, and Mountaineers. So we see in River of Earth this family that is essentially at the mercy of the success and failure of the coal industry. In boom years, the mines are open, people are working. In bust years, the mines are closed. There is no other industry. They have lost, they have been, the way of life that they had known before the coal industry, which was a way of subsistence farming, of trade, of barter, of taking care of themselves, has been lost to them. So they are captive then to the coal industry. And this is real. This is realistic. This is actually history. Additional conflicts that you see is between, well, the primary conflict is just that. It's of people trying to survive in a world in a world in which the things that they have traditionally known, that they have traditionally worked for them, down to their cultural ideas, no longer serve. And this conflict is embodied in two of the main characters, in the parents in the story, Bracken and Alpha Baldridge. Brack, the father, identifies himself as a miner. He's a worker. He wants to go back to work. He's desperate for the mines to come open again so he can go back to work. Alpha, the mother, identifies more with the traditions of the subsistence lifestyle. She wants to keep a big garden. She wants to do things as they were done traditionally. Have a subsistence farm. Have hogs. Take care of themselves, to stay away from the mines, to exist as their own simple kind of industry. So let's look then, take a look at River of Earth, and assume you have this copy or a similar copy. This is the University of Kentucky copy. Now, one of the things that I hope you have already noticed is that each chapter in River of Earth is very much self-contained, as almost a work of its own, almost as if they are individual short stories or even little plays that can exist outside of the novel as a whole. In the first chapter, we're introduced to the family. The boy narrator, the young narrator, is speaking. He's telling us about what's going on. And the situation is that the mines are closed. Everyone in the entire county is suffering the same way. They're all at the point of starvation. And in the Baldridge home, they have the added burden of having to take care of Brack's kin. Two of Brack's cousins are there, and then an uncle comes later on. Two of Father's cousins, Harl and Tib Logan, came with the closing of the mines and did not go away. It's all we can do to keep bread in the children's mouths, Mother told Father. Even if they are your blood kin, we can't feed them much longer. Mother knew the strings of shucky beans dried in the fall would not last until a new garden could be raised. A half dozen soup bones and some meat rinds were left in the smokehouse. Skippers had gotten to a pork shoulder during the unnaturally warm December and it had to be thrown away. And Father's response, and some mother is saying, she's very practical. And so we have only enough food for ourselves. We can't maintain the family as well. That would seem like an easy conflict, except that would seem like an easy resolution. Just tell them to leave. That's what she is encouraging. But the father, he is bound by cultural mores. He can't tell them to leave. That's not within the culture. It's not within him to do that. You'll have to ask them to go, Mother told Father. These lazy louts are taking food out of the baby's mouth. What we have won't last forever. Father did not speak for a long time. Then he said simply, I can't turn my kin out. Now, if you consider the traditional way of life that the mining industry and rapid modernization has disrupted, that makes perfectly good sense. That the extended family would take care of each other. And in a different time and a different system of survival, that works. Those are strategies that work. You don't turn away your kinfolk. You take care of your kinfolk takes care of you. Everybody subsides together, lives together, makes it together because everybody is contributing. But all that has been disrupted. But the father is held by that. He can't break out of that convention. And it is not going to work. But that's a very significant conflict. It's not an easy thing for him to overcome. As long as we've got a crust, it'll never be said, I turned my folks from my door. Harl and Tib are maybe it's the real villain of River of Earth. There's not a person, a character who's a villain. The real villain is the situation. The real villain, of course, is it's the whole privation that is caused by the disruption of life by the mining industry. But Harl and Tib as characters are a little bit villainous. They're not terribly villainous, but they cause problems. They want to disrupt things. They want to hurt things. They want to just make trouble. And they're portrayed in this chapter as kind of being greedy and eating more than they should. And then when Uncle Samp comes, and Uncle Samp is described as almost a kind of a larger-than-life, almost mythical character. Very often in River of Earth, you see characters that almost seem like they step out of a myth of some kind. Uncle Samp is described like that. Uncle Samp was a large man. See, checking my time there. His skin was soft and white, with small pink veins webbing his cheeks and nose. There were no powder burns on his face and hands, and no coal dust ground into the heavy wrinkles of his neck. He had a thin gray mustache over a handspan in length, wrapped like a loose cord around his ears, so you can imagine this. Now, keep in mind also the narrative perspective, this young boy who views the world with childlike wonder, literally with childlike wonder. So he is seeing everything that he is seeing here. Uncle Samp seems magical to him. They talk of Uncle Samp as his mustache. It put a spell on us all, fathers, cousins included. So all the conflicts that are established for this first chapter. Now, there's an interlude here where the family goes out of the house. They're all in this house, and they go to the smokehouse just to get away, just to get off by themselves. So the mother, the father, the narrator, the little brother, the sister, and the baby that the mother is breastfeeding. And the mother is eating so that she can breastfeed the baby, but she doesn't have enough food for that. But when they get into the smokehouse, they find that there's a great pleasure just in being away from the family, getting away from all those and just being by themselves, and they're much happier. The mother says, "It's the first time we've been alone in 2 months. If we lived in here, there wouldn't be room for anybody else, and it would be healthier than that leaky shack we stay in." Father kept crawling with the baby, kicking up his feet like a spoiled nag. Fletch hurt his leg again. He gritted his teeth and showed us the purple spot where he had been kicked. He had been kicked under the table by Carl and Tib. It's part of the meanness in them. Father rubbed the bruise and made it feel better. "Their hearts are black as Satan," Mother said. "I'd rather live in this smokehouse than stay down there with them. A big house draws kinfolks like a horse draws knit flies." Now, that's one of those expressions I had mentioned earlier. Most of these, you can divine by context. You don't have to have heard the term knit fly to be able to figure out what it is. But those kinds of expressions that we'll see. So what happens? Carl and Tib enact a bit of meanness. They cut off Uncle Samp's mustache that he has not shaved in 30 years and he is so proud of. And they leave before he wakes and before he discovers that this has happened. So that conflict just kicks things off. Uncle Samp awakes, he's enraged, he throws the narrator, he's the first one he encounters, against the wall, and he goes out looking just enraged. Now the mother comes to a wonderfully interesting solution. That's enough for her. That's all she can take. So she has she and the children move all of the furnishings out of the house. And then she sets fire to the house. So, as she had said before, if we lived in the smokehouse, there'd be only room enough for us, and the family, we wouldn't be bothered by them. So her solution is to burn down the house, which is not in good shape to begin with. The roof leaks and has other problems. In the last paragraph of this chapter, page 11, "When the flames were highest, leaping through the charred rafters, a gun fired repeatedly in the valley. Someone there had noticed the smoke and was arousing the folk along Little Car Creek. When they arrived, the walls had fallen in, and Mother stood among the scattered furnishings, her face calm and triumphant. She has won this battle." Okay, very subtle way. Okay, but you see the conflict that the father has. The conflict. He can't turn his kin away. He is bound. This is cultural. This is deep within him. There's right and wrong, and to turn the kinfolks away is wrong. It's morally the wrong thing to do within the culture that he knows and that has made him. Now, in the next chapter, that conflict, that cultural conflict, continues and manifests itself in a slightly different way. They've made it through the winter. They have a small garden going. It's not quite ready for harvesting yet. Some of this detail. "We lived the spring in the smokehouse, sleeping in 2 beds, pushed close into the corners, and with strings of peppers and onions hanging from the rafters overhead. We planted our garden early, using the seeds Mother had hoarded, but it was long before the vegetables were ready for eating. Going to the next chapter. Father's face was thin as a saw blade. Take a moment to enjoy that image. Thin as a saw blade. It's a physical detail that you can look at, you can appreciate it. You can see the quality of his face. And the image of a saw blade would come from his world, that is, of the setting. So the imagery that Still uses works for my reading because it is not imposed upon the text. It arises from the detail of the text itself, the detail of the setting. Some of the other detail and the imagery that you get. The next page, page 13, this description of the garden. The garden grew as by a miracle, and the blackberry winter passed with the early April winds, doing no harm. Beans broke their waxen leaves out of whole-turned furrows, bearing the husk of seeds with them. Sweet corn unfurled tight young blades from weed mold, timid to night chill, growing slowly and darkly. That simple description of the garden growing, it's so active. And so Still is he's giving us visual imagery here. Everything is visual, and he also uses sound often in his imagery. So much of this is about the language. That's how we get the sense of this world, is the language that Still employs. Page 15. On the day the men came from Blackjack. Blackjack is the coal town, the coal camp. In these early days, it was common for the miners to live in the proximity of the mines. So there would be these shacks, little shacks that grow up around right where the mine is. They're living right where they work. On the day the men came from Blackjack, Mother was washing clothes, and Father swung the battling stick for her on a chestnut stump. What's a battling stick? Well, you can imagine it probably from context, but it's literally something that is used to beat the clothes, to get the dirt out, to wash, to help with the washing. Yulie saw the men first as they climbed the hill from Little Car Creek, and she ran to tell us, these 3 men are coming, and they got mine caps sitting on their heads, and 2 of them have got pokes. You know what a poke is. It's a little bag, a sack. Be appalled if at least some of you didn't know what a poke is. So they've come and they're carrying these bags, and the father knows the men. They're his neighbors. He's worked with them in the mines, and they've come because they're starving, as well. And on page 16, it's Fruit Corbett and Ab Stevel and Sid Piddler, Father said. Fruit used to be storekeeper before the mine closed. The men came into the yard looking at the gray pile of ashes and charred ends of rafters where our house had burned. We heard about your burning, Fruit said, a pure pity with times so hard and all the mines closed up tight as a jug. We'd have come and raised you a house, but we heard you was living in the smokehouse and getting along pert. You see that the way Still was doing dialect there. And I can tell you, just reading it aloud as compared to that of John Fox Jr., it is so much easier to read. Try reading it aloud. Try reading John Fox Jr. aloud with a dialect. You will see what I'm talking about. So they've managed to survive the winter, but they're in even worse shape than the family. And they've come to ask if they can be spared some food from the garden. And on page 17, begging comes hard for us who's used to working for our bread, Ab said. The beans ain't half growed yet, Father explained. They ain't nigh filled out. We ain't asking you to give us nothing, Fruit said, the wrinkles around his eyes webbing. You'll be paid when the mine's open. Aye, God, we're asking for no handout. Our folks need some green victuals. They ain't nigh ready, Father said. And again, and he trod up and down in his tracks without moving from where he stood. Visualize that for a moment. He's trod up and down in his tracks without moving where he stood. He's pacing but standing still. What does that indicate to you about what he is feeling? You can see just in that movement the frustration that he feels, the agony that he feels, the anguish that he feels, the conflict, and still doesn't tell us that he feels anguish. He shows the anguish to us, the way the Father behaves, what the Father says. The Father is trying to protest as best he can. The garden's not ready. The beans are not full enough yet. And then he has to give in. I got my first hungry ones to turn down. I never yet turned a body down. Go and see what you can find fitting to eat. It's all he feels that he can do. So they go into the garden and they take everything they can get, that they can find, that looks like it's nearly ready to eat. And there's a wonderful moment on page 18. The Father is speaking, you can't turn down folks who are starving. Those are the values of his culture. And he knew his words sounded foolish and with no weight. That's a tragic moment. It's a wonderful, real conflict. Not turning down people who are starving, that would seem to be a given. That's a cultural mores that should work. But in this situation, it works against him. It's the wrong thing to do. He began to hang a tub full of clothes on the line, spreading them out clumsily, and it sagged, and the shirt sleeves were barely clear of the ground. He tightened the line, drawing the raveled cord with all his strength. Why does he do that? Okay, well, he does that because he has to do something. He is so frustrated. He is so conflicted. He's in so much turmoil. He goes and he tries to do something by just hanging the clothes on the line, as if, that is at least that's something to be done, maybe to distract himself. And then at the end, Ab hurried down the hill to catch the others, the rocks rattling under his feet. Yulie grabbed the mole, there's been a mole in the garden, and was gone with it before Father could stop her, running swiftly around the house. And Mother ran too, swinging her arms in dismay, for she had heard the clothesline break, and the clean garments now lay miserably in the dirt. That is an image of the Father's anguish. He has caused this catastrophe. Though he was trying to do good, he was trying to do something of value by hanging the clothes on the line, leads to disaster. It's as strong of an image, as compelling an image as you can imagine, to relate the conflict, the thematic conflict that he is feeling at this moment, and that runs through the text in its entirety. Okay, in the next chapter, and you notice that each of those chapters that they've had these conflicts within themselves, that conflicts that feed the overall conflict of the text itself, of the novel itself, but there are also built and resolved within the length of the chapters. In this next chapter, it's the narrator's 7th birthday. This chapter, I characterize it as a coming-of-age story, literally as a coming-of-age story. That's a type of story. And in a coming-of-age story, we have a character who goes through experience. And at the end of the story, the character has grown in some way. He has suffered something, some kind of a turmoil. He has gone on a journey, and he has been made different by the end of the story. He has grown in learning and intelligence. He's changed in some way. Okay, so it says the narrator's 7th birthday. He's very excited about this. I knew it was good to be 7, but I didn't know how to think of it. So there's this innocence about him at the beginning of this chapter here. There's a bit of a reflection here. Sitting there, I thought that I would grow up into such a man as Grandpa Middleton had been before he got killed, learning to read and write and to draw up deeds for land, and I would learn to plow and have acres of my own. Never would I be a miner digging a darksome holes. First mention of Grandpa Middleton. And that is another of the conflicts that we have in the book. Grandpa Middleton, we'll learn later on, was murdered. He was killed by a man named Os Coggins, who is still alive. The Middletons did not automatically go and shoot him, so there's not this feud that rises up out of this event. In John Fox Jr., an incident like that would lead to a feud. But there's a deeper kind of struggle that occurs in this. As we'll learn later on, the children have actually been forbidden from harming Os Coggins by the mother, who knows what that will lead to. So just keep that in mind. Okay. So one of the neighbors, Clay Brannon, has come to ask for the father's help. The father is good with animals. He's not a veterinarian, but he is good with livestock. He knows some things to do, and we'll see a couple of incidents throughout the novel where the father's skills with animals is on wonderful display in remarkable, vivid detail. So on the day I was 7, this is page 22, Clay Brannon came for father. His mare was in labor, and he had come wanting help, bringing an extra nag for father to ride. Father was handy with stock and knew a lot of cures. He knew what to do for blind staggers, the studs and bloats. He knew how to help a mare along with her when her time came. And the father decides on this occasion to take the narrator with him. He's 7 years old. It's a big thing. He's never gone with his father on something like this before. Father looked down at me, standing there laughing with mother. Think I'll fotch this little dirty mouth along for ballast, he said. He reached down, pulling me into the saddle behind him, and I went up over the hindquarters, limp with surprise, for father had never taken me along before. We rode off down the hill, but I did not look back for all of my joy. Knowing that Fletch's face was shriveled with jealousy, and knowing that I was 7, and this thing was as it should be. He's going on this journey. He's 7 years old. It's an adventure. And the father says, there's this talk about possibility that Clay might give the father the colt that's about to be born, or the filly that's going to be born, as payment for helping. And this, of course, makes the narrator very excited. Okay, now the detail that we have of the mare in foal on page 27, bottom of page 26 leading into 27. The mare began to strain, drawing her muscles into cords, and I saw 2 small hoofs. Father stood over her, looping a grass rope around the colt's thin legs. I knew then the pain of flesh coming into life. That is a wonderful phrase, the pain of flesh coming into life. And I turned and ran with the sight burning before my eyes, and my body cold and goose-pimpled. Standing behind the barn, I was ashamed of my fear, though I could not go back until it was over. My humiliation was as loud as the guinea fowls crying in the young grass at the lodge gate. That sound, I mentioned the use of sounds to illustrate, to provide imagery. My humiliation was as loud as the guinea fowls, that association. The narrator is very sensitive. He is sensitive to everything. He is sensitive to the suffering of animals. He is sensitive to the suffering of other people. Though as a child he may not understand it, that sensitivity is part of what makes this narrative voice compelling. It makes it work. He is able to relate the suffering that he senses around him. He is, in contrast to this other boy, Clabe's son, whose name is Oates, and he is very much of a rough-seeming child. Page 28. Words were great upon my tongue, but with Clabe and Oates there, I could not speak them. My hope for being able to take the colt that's just been born home, for having that for itself. My hope seemed a bloated grain of corn on a diseased ear, large and expectant, yet having no soundness beneath. Imagery, poetic lyrics, lyrical imagery. So Oates and the narrator are off by themselves. And Oates knows that his father is considering, giving the colt. They've had this conversation about the foal could go to be given to Brack as a kind of payment for helping. And Oates doesn't want this. He's a very rough child. He has no sensitivity about it whatsoever. On page 30, he has the narrator off by himself. He's older than the narrator. He's bigger than the narrator. Oates stopped under a tree, his eyes hard and his voice nettled. I hear tell you Baldridges is spotted round the liver, he said, meaning cowardly. Oscoggins killed your grandpap Middleton, and none of your kin done a thing to him. He's living free as wind. It's a lie tale you heard, I said. It's gospel truth, he said. I seen you run away when the colt was a-borning, and I brung you down here to show nobody's going to take him now, nor no time coming. And they have a fight, fist fight, and Oates ends up hitting the narrator on the head with a stick and knocks him down. And, ain't no yellow dog coward Baldridge going to get my colt, he said. That there one's belonging to me, and I'd break his neck before I'd let him be tuck off. The contrast in character. And we've reached the end of the day. They're going back home. The colt actually has died. It has not survived the birth. The foal has not survived the birth. And they're going back home. And this the very last paragraph that we have in this chapter. And you'll see the contrast in mood that the narrator has from the very beginning of the chapter, which was the start of the day. It's still the same day, but now we're at the end of the day. I walked along bitter with loss, comforted only by the cruel wisdom that the colt had been spared Oates's rusty hands. Being 7 on that day, and bruised and sore from fighting, the years rested like an enormous burden on my swollen eyes. The years rested like an enormous burden. You're 7 years old. He began the day in this wonderful, excited innocence, and he has ended this day with cruel wisdom. Remarkable as a story. Next chapter, we have another character introduced. This is Uncle Jolly. This is Alpha's brother. And he is something of a comic character in that he is always joking, he is always playing tricks, and talking about the idea of a rusty, and a rusty is just essentially a harmless trick that would be played on somebody, and with the expectation that the trick would be played back and they'd be gotten back in some way. The kinds of things that Harl and Tib, the mean cousins, get up to cross the line. They're harmful. The things that Jolly does, they're essentially harmless. They're for good humor. They're for just pleasure for everyone involved. Jolly also is kind of a rascal, and he is always getting in trouble and ending up in jail for some reason, for getting in a fight or just whatever, for something or other. His purpose in coming to visit is he's been told by Alpha's mother, by the mother, to go around to all the children and see how everyone is doing, and he is doing that. It's page 35. I sought out on old Poppet, the horse, because Ma sent me. Son, she says, you make a circle round and see how the chaps are. See Alpha and tall and loose. Tell them their old mommy is longing to set eyes on them again. Tell them if when they get out of something to eat, there's always a dustin' o' meal in my barrel. The mines ain't opened yet, Father said. They're laying a new spur of track, so it won't be long. No use stirring the top of the ground if you're going to dig your bread underside. I wouldn't work in a coal mine if there was gold tracks running in. I'll be buried aplenty when I'm dead. Don't want bug dust in my face till then. Okay, so one of the rusties that Jolly plays here is he gives the narrator and his brother two little balls of sap. Tells them that they're gum that he's brought from the store, and it's tree sap. And when they chew on it, it sticks in their teeth and sticks their jaws together, and they get upset by it. But it's essentially a harmless kind of a joke. And he explains to them the idea of the rusty. See if I can find this. Yeah, okay, so he says, Fletch began to cry. His mouth was gummed tight. Uncle Jolly blew a great breath and stopped laughing. He thrust a finger far into Fletch's mouth, scraping the gum off his teeth. That there's no way to act when a feller pulls a rusty on you, he said. Take it like a man and start figuring on one to get even. So, that's the idea of the rusty. Essentially what occurs in this chapter is we have the introduction of Jolly. We have a brief discussion about Oscoggin, so that situation is just gradually, bit by bit, being revealed to us. If you go to page 41, did you come along down Sand Lick by Oscoggin's place? I did. I ain't dodging nor surrounding nobody. Anything quar about his barn? Burnt down. Fresh ashes, I noticed. Father set his eyes on Uncle Jolly. I heard it burnt, and I've been trying to line who done it, he said. That barn wasn't lightning struck. Feller who lit the fire opened the stall doors and locked gates. The stock was driv out first. Don't look auger holes through me, Uncle Jolly said. You ain't Judge Malden setting court. I bet Oss won't be going before the grand jury saying I fired his barn. Oss is already scared enough of you Middletons. I reckon he's died 9 times over thinking one of you might plug him someday for killing your pap. So Oss has not exactly gotten off. So things, he has bad luck. He's had bad fortune ever since he has killed the father. Looky here, Brackstone, I ain't going to kill nobody unless it's have to. That shooting was done when I was a chap. years ago. I bear remember. Now I'll scrap and tear up the patch, but I won't kill. That contrast with the characters that we would see in Trail of the Lonesome Pine. So the resolution to this chapter, Yulie, the sister, and Fletch, the brother, the narrator, they put some burrs under the saddle on old Poppet, on Jolly's horse. And Uncle Jolly put a foot in the stirrup. He glanced down at Yulie and me. He keened his eyes and twisted his mouth. He sprang upward, though not into the seat, coming down instead astraddle the mare's hips. Old Poppet jumped and whinnied, starting off at a gallop. Uncle Jolly squirmed, raising himself off the mare's back. Yulie tried to whisper something to me, but her voice was as shrill as the giddy hen's. I put a handful of snatch burrs under the saddle, she said. There goes a born fool, Father said. Okay, this video is about an hour long now. That's probably a good point to stop. What I want is, the next lecture video I'll do, and I'll have done this week, we'll finish the first part of River of Earth, and that will go to page 98. So have read through page 98, and then we'll be in the second section of the book. There are 3 sections. So I'll have another video up very soon that takes us through the rest of this part. So be responsible for that. And I will also have very soon a revised reading plan to take us through the rest of the semester. We'll finish River of Earth. Take us another week or so. We'll go from there to Kinfolks, and then we'll have some stories and some things from other authors to look at.